that's clearly the side of the room that's in Georgetown. So, you guys who. So it's a great privilege to be here alongside of Shannon to open this meeting, and I want to thank Trevor and Butch and the rest of NDIP and NDSA for the invitation. Going to try to bring the room lights down a little bit so that we can see the slides a little bit better. And I'm just going to go ahead and begin. So this Earthrise was photographed by the lunar orbiter on August 24th, 1966. It predates the familiar and iconic Earthrise image by some 2 years. The restored first photo was released to the public on April 22nd, 2014, so just a few months ago, as part of an effort aimed at recovering imagery from the robotic probe, which was the first spacecraft to actually orbit the moon. To date, some 2,000 of the orbiter's shots have been rescued from nearly 50 years of dormant tape storage by a team working out of a former McDonald's near NASA Ames in Silicon Valley. Can folks hear me okay, by the way? Is the microphone good? Yep. Yeah. 2 days after the publication of the lunar orbiter image, 2 days on April 24th, 2014, came another press release also concerning the recovery of images from obsolescent media, but of a rather different sort. A group based at Carnegie Mellon had identified and retrieved computer-generated graphics created by Andy Warhol on an Amiga 1000 personal computer in 1985. Acting on a hunch from new media artist and Warhol authority, Corey Archangel, the group forensically imaged floppy diskettes at the Andy Warhol Museum. After some elaborate intermediary steps, including reverse engineering the proprietary format in which the files were originally created and stored, the previously unseen images were released to the public. And as befits a find of this magnitude, a dozen new Warhols, press coverage was extensive in all the major media outlets. 2 days after that came yet another bonanza for digital preservation, April 26, 2014. This was the day of the already legendary Atari excavation in the New Mexico desert. For those of you who don't know the story, for decades, rumor had it that the Atari Corporation, facing financial ruin in the wake of the disastrous release of the notoriously awful E.T. game, had dumped thousands, or maybe it was tens of thousands, or maybe it was hundreds of thousands of game cartridges in a landfill outside Alamogordo as a means of disposing of unsellable product. Earlier this year, a group of documentary filmmakers obtained the necessary permissions and permits, hired the heavy equipment, and started to dig. Within hours, they had found what they were looking for. The photographs that quickly blanketed the web were, I think, haunting, what media theorist Stephen Jackson would perhaps call broken world imagery. Resonant for the familiar shapes and artwork, distorted, eroded, corroded by soil and environmental agents. No lost prototypes or other rarities were found. In fact, the games themselves are all widely available and have been playable for years, thanks to the retro community. In contrast to both the Lunar Orbiter project and the Warhol images, this was not a discovery about content. It was about aura and allure, sifting the literal grit of what we now widely acknowledge as digital materiality. So I begin with this miraculous 7-day stretch, in part simply to celebrate these path-breaking achievements and the widespread public visibility that accrued from them. Digital preservation makes headlines now, seemingly routinely. And the work performed by the community gathered here is the bedrock underlying such high-profile endeavors. But I also want to set the stage for one more news cycle that followed several weeks later, one which garnered similar levels of public interest, but speaks to a rather different dynamic. Not the discovery and release of dramatic new content, not the aura of actual artifacts excavated from the desert sands, but rather something else, something quirkier and arguably more intimate. On May 13th, in conversation with Conan O'Brien, George R.R. Martin, author, of course, of the Game of Thrones novels, revealed that he did all of his writing on a DOS-based machine disconnected from the internet and lovingly maintained solely to run WordStar. Martin dubbed this his secret weapon and suggested that the lack of distraction as well as the isolation from computer viruses, which he apparently regards as more rapacious than any dragon's fire, this accounts for his long-running productivity. And thus, as they say, it is known. The Conan O'Brien clip went viral, Gawker, Boing Boing, Twitter, Facebook, everybody picked it up. Many commenters immediately, if indulgently, branded Martin a Luddite, while others opined it was no wonder it was taking him so long to finish the whole Fire and Ice saga, or less charitably, no wonder it all seemed so interminable. But WordStar is no toy or half-baked bit of code. On the contrary, it was a triumph of both software engineering and what we would nowadays call user-centered design. The brainchild of programmer Rob Barnaby and microprose Seymour Rubinstein, WordStar dominated the home computer market for the first half of the 1980s before losing out to WordPerfect itself to be eclipsed by Microsoft Word. Originally a CP/M application that was later ported to DOS, WordStar was the software of choice for owners of the early luggables like the Kaypro computer and the Osborne One. The writers who cut their teeth on it include names as diverse as Michael Chabon, Ralph Ellison, William F. Buckley, and Anne Rice, who also equipped her vampire Lestat with the software when it came time for him to write his own Eldritch memoirs. WordStar was justifiably advertised as early as 1978 as a what you see is what you get word processor, a marketing claim that would be echoed by Microsoft when Word was launched in 1983. WordStar's real virtues, though, are not captured by its feature list alone. As Ralph Ellison's scholar Adam Bradley observes in his work on Ellison's use of the program, WordStar's interface is modeled on the longhand method of composition rather than on the typewriter. In other words, a power user like Ellison or George R.R. Martin, who has internalized the keyboard commands, would navigate and edit a document as seamlessly as picking up a pencil to mark any part of the page. Now, WordStar runs no less efficiently and behaves no differently in 2014 than it did in 1983, but if you're running it today, you must be a Luddite, or at the very least, a curmudgeonly author of high fantasy whose success allows you to indulge your eccentricities. This is what was so fascinating to me about the public reaction to this seemingly recondite detail about Martin's writing process. A specific piece of antiquarian software, WordStar 4.0 to be exact, is taken as a clue or a cue to the personality and persona of its user. The software, in other words, becomes an indexical measure of the famous author. The old school command line intricacy of its interface somehow in keeping with Martin's quirky public image, part paternalistic grandfather and part Doctor Who character. We know, that is, most of us of a certain age remember just enough about WordStar to make Martin's mention of it compelling and captivating. But what is WordStar? It's not content per se, nor is it any actual thing, or is it? WordStar is software, and software, as Yale computer scientist David Gelernter has stated, is, quote, stuff unlike any other. What is software then, really? What is WordStar? Just as early filmmakers couldn't have predicted the level of ongoing interest in their work over 100 years later, who can say what future generations will find important to know and preserve about the early history of software? Lev Manovich, who will be speaking tomorrow, is generally credited with having inaugurated the academic field of software studies. He recently published a book on the early history of multimedia. That project, like my own on the literary history of word processing, presents considerable difficulties at the level of locating the primary sources. Here's Lev in an interview he did about the book. Quote, "While I was doing this research, I was shocked to realize how little visual documentation of the key systems and software exists." He's thinking of things like Sketchpad and the Xerox Alto. "We have original articles published about these systems with small black and white illustrations and just a few low-resolution film clips, nothing else. None of the historically important systems exist in emulation, so you can't get a feeling for what it was like to use them." The emerging challenges of software preservation were explored just over a year ago at a two-day meeting at the Library of Congress called Preserving.exe. As Henry Lowood, himself a participant in that meeting, as was I, has subsequently noted, this was hardly the first attempt to convene an organized gathering around the subject. Notable earlier efforts included the 1990 Art In-House Summit in the Catskills, which actually included representation from Apple, Microsoft, and HP, alongside of the Smithsonian and other cultural heritage stakeholders, for purposes of launching a national software archives. Nonetheless, more than 2 decades later, a room full of computer historians, technical experts, archivists, academics, and industry representatives once again came together to discuss what role the nation's premier cultural heritage institutions, from the library and the Smithsonian to the Internet Archive, ought to play in gathering and maintaining collections of games and other software for posterity. Now, you can read various accounts of and responses to that meeting in the Preserving.exe report that was published on NDIP's website. But more than a year out from the event itself, the report's impact and uptake remains modest, and as recently as 2014, in any case, the annual NDSA agenda included no mention of the preservation of executable content as an area to address. Thus, even as libraries, archives, and museums now routinely confront the challenges of massive quantities of content in digital format, actual software, not George R.R. Martin's document files, not the character data, but WordStar itself, remains a narrow niche or lesser priority. Matthew Fuller, editor of Software Studies, a Lexicon, recent MIT Press book, puts it this way in his introduction to the subject, quote, "While computer science and related disciplines have now accreted half a century of work on this domain, software is often a blind spot in the wider, broadly cultural theorization and study of computational and networked digital media. Software is seen as a tool, something you do something with. Software studies, as a subfield of digital media studies, thus offers a framework for historicizing software and dislodging it from its purely instrumental sphere. Besides Manovich and Fuller, key names in software studies include Wendy Chun, Noah Wardrip-Fruin, Laurie Emerson, Shannon Mattern, and, yes, German media theorist Friedrich Kittler, who memorably proclaimed, "There is no software." I would now like to take a few moments to offer my own elaboration of a software studies framework by sketching some different reference points, vectors, if you will, not so much for defining software, but for demonstrating the range of ways one might seek to circumscribe it as an object of preservation. Software as asset, the legal perspective. In 1969, the US Justice Department opened an antitrust suit against IBM, the result of which was that IBM unbundled, that was their term, the practice of providing programs, software, to its clients for free as part of its hardware operations. Instead, IBM introduced the distinction between system control programs and program products. The latter became a saleable commodity. IBM's unbundling decision is often cited as a catalyst for the emergence of software as a distinct area of activity within computer science and engineering at large. The point I would make here is that the object we call software is a legal and commercial construct as much as it is a technological one. Software as package, the engineer's perspective. Computer historian Thomas Hay has argued that the key moment for conceptualizing software came when its originators began thinking about packaging their code so as to share it with others. Hay makes the analogy to envelopes for letters and shipping containers. In practice, packaging the software meant conceiving of the software object not just in terms of code, but also systems requirements, documentation, support, even the tacit knowledge required to run it. What turned programs into software, Hay concludes, was the work of packaging needed to transport them effectively from one group to another. Software becomes software, in other words, when it is made portable. Software as shrink wrap, the consumer's perspective. As Lowood has argued, this is the model that has dominated institutional collecting to date, notably at places like Stanford and the Stephen Cabernetti Collection and the Library of Congress's own efforts at the Culpeper facility. The obvious appeal here is that most shrink-wrap software is about the same size as a Hollinger box. No, I'm kidding, of course. But the appeal is clearly that it's easy to visualize shrink-wrap software as an artifact, and thus integrate it into collecting practices already in place for artifacts of other sorts, nor is this a spurious consideration. On the contrary, the artwork, inserts, documentation, and so-called feelies that were part of what came in the box are vital to a history of software. Software as a kind of notation or score. Here we're talking about actual source code, and the musical analogy is more than casual. Thomas Scoville gives us a striking account of a programmer who conceives of his coding as akin to conducting a jazz ensemble. Quote, Steve had started by thumping down the cursor in the editor and riffing. It was all jazz to him. The first day he built a rudimentary device driver. It was kind of like a backbeat. Day 2, he built some routines for data storage and abstraction. That was the baseline. Today, he had rounded out the rhythm section with a compact packet-based communication protocol handler. Now he was finishing up with the cool, wailing harmonies of the top-level control loops. I love that. Yet, scores, too, are always, of course, artifacts, themselves materially embodied and instantiated. Software as object. Here I deliberately use the word object in multiple valences, both to connote the binary executable, as well as its resonance with object-oriented programming, itself a paradigm about modularity and reuse, and perhaps even the emerging philosophical discourse around so-called object-oriented ontologies, or OOO, associated with figures like Graham Harman. OOO argues for the virtues of what it terms a non-correlationist worldview, one in which human actors are not the sole agents or foci or loci of experience. As described on its website, the work of the National Software Reference Library at NIST is to, quote, obtain digital signatures or hashes that uniquely identify the files in the software packages, quote. To date, the NSRL contains some 20 million unique hash values, thus delineating a non-human ecology of 20 million distinct digital objects. Yet the NSRL is not a public-facing collection, and it has no provisions for the circulation of software, nor does it facilitate the execution of legacy code. Software as craft, the artisan's perspective. Here I have in mind accounts of software development which deliberately position themselves in opposition to enterprise-level software engineering. Not Microsoft Word, but Scrivener. Mark Bernstein of Eastgate Systems puts it this way, quote, "Your writing doesn't come from a factory, neither does artisanal software. These are programs with attitude, with fresh ideas and exciting new approaches. Small teams work every day to polish and improve them. If you have a question or need something unusual, you can talk directly to the people who handcraft the software." Software as epigraphy. Yes, I mean written in stone. Trevor Owens has noted the uncannily compelling feature of the tombstones in the classic game Oregon Trail. To quote Trevor, "What makes the tombstones fascinating was their persistence. What you wrote out for your characters on their tombstones persisted into the games of future players of your particular copy of the game. These graves enacted the passage of time in the game, each play apparently happening after the previous, as deaths and often absurd messages piled up alongside the trail," end quote. Likewise, consider the Easter egg. One of the most famous is to be found in Lauren Robinette's graphical adaptation of Adventure for the Atari 2600. As others have argued, this was an important and innovative game, released in 1979, establishing many of the conventions we use to depict virtual space today, such as exiting a room through one side of the screen and emerging in a logically adjoining room on a new screen. Now, at the time, Atari's programmers were not credited in the documentation for any of the games they worked on, so Robinette created an Easter egg that allowed a player to display his name, Robinette's, on the screen by finding and transporting a one-pixel object. This seemingly slight gesture, in fact, speaks volumes about shifting attitudes towards software as a cultural artifact. Does code have authors? Is software written the way we write a book? Robinette's game will surely outlast him. Is this a tombstone or a title page? Software as click wrap. This is perhaps the dominant model today, combining the familiar online storefront with advanced DRM and cloud-based content distribution. Software as hardware. Born of a doubtless chimerical conviction and commitment to authenticity, it is nonetheless a preservation model taking hold in some of our more liminal spaces, such as the Media Archaeology Lab at the University of Colorado and the Maryland Institute for Technology and the Humanities. Here, for example, is WordStar running on a working Kpro we maintain at MIF. Similarly, Jim Bolton has done phenomenal work preserving the browser software of the early web. Software as social media. Let's see. The GitHub phenomenon. You may think of GitHub as a place to stash your code. That's not how they think of it, however. GitHub believes that the future of creativity, commerce, and culture is executable. At the preserving.exe meeting, a representative from GitHub made the connection to such high-minded ideals all but explicit, declaring the software culture on the web a new cultural canon and invoking the likes of Emerson, the Beowulf poet, and Adam Smith. Software as background. New media artist Jeff Thompson has collected some 11,000 screenshots documenting every computer appearing usually in the background of every episode of the TV series Law and Order. We can learn much from incidental popular representations of software. Compare, for example, the extremely realistic depictions of the applications the characters use in the movie adaptations of Stieg Larsson's Millennium series to the fanciful and extravagant interfaces of many Hollywood blockbusters. Michael Douglas disclosure. What can such shifts and contrasts tell us about popular attitudes toward software? Software as paper trail, the documentary perspective. In 2012, I spent a week in the archives at Microsoft in Redmond, Washington, looking at the early history of Word. I spent almost all of my time looking at paper, specs, requirements, design documents, memos and correspondence, marketing research, advertising and promotional materials. But besides corporate entities such as Microsoft, documentary software archives are available at such institutions as the Charles Babbage Institute, the University of Texas, the Strong Museum of Play, as well again as Stanford. Software as service. Facebook and YouTube, but also future iterations of such formerly shrink-wrapped products as Microsoft Office, the Microsoft Office suite. What's notable about the service model is that it's also supplying some of the most promising models we have for preservation. The Olive project at Carnegie Mellon is exploring solutions for streaming virtual machines as a preservation strategy. Likewise, Jason Scott, you knew I would get there eventually, didn't you? Has been doing simply astounding work with the JS Mess team at the Internet Archive, turning emulated software into web content akin to embedded video and other standard browser features. This, of course, is WordStar. ET is there too. Is all of this legal, you ask? Talk to the guy in the funny hat. Finally, software as big data. Jason Scott again. Having ingested thousands of disk images and ROMs into the Internet Archive's historical software collection, Jason is now algorithmically analyzing them, taking screenshots at intervals and storing these for posterity on the Internet Archive servers. Software, in other words, preserving software, machines preserving machines. Have you seen this movie before? So that's what I've got. Over a dozen different approaches in all. Doubtless there are others. I haven't talked about software as apps, software as abandonware, or as bits to be curated, or as virtual worlds. But underlying all of these different approaches, or frameworks as I have called them, is the more fundamental one of what it means to think of software as a human artifact, a made thing, tangible and present for all of its supposed virtual ineffability. Scott Rosenberg, whose book Dreaming in Code furnishes a masterful first-hand account of an ultimately failed software development project, says this: bridges are, with skyscrapers and dams and similar monumental structures, the visual representation of our technical mastery over the physical universe. In the past half-century, software has emerged as an invisible yet pervasive counterpart to such world-shaping artifacts. We tend to conceptualize software and communicate about it using very tangible metaphors. Let's fork that build. Do you have the patch? What's the code base? Software may be stuff unlike any other, it may even be intangible, but it is still a thing indisputably there as a logical, spatial, and imaginative artifact subject to craft and technique, to error and human foible. Writing software is not an abstract exercise. It is art and design, intuition and discipline, tradition and individual talent. And over time, the program takes shape as a wrought object, a made thing that represents one single realization of concepts and ideas that could have been expressed and instantiated in any number of other renderings. Software is thus perhaps best understood as a dynamic artifact, not some abstract ephemeral essence, not even just as lines of written instructions or code, but as something that builds up layers of tangible history through the years, something that contains stories and subplots and dramatis personae. Programmers even have a name for the way in which software tends to accrete as layers of sedimentary history, fossils and relics of past versions and developmental dead ends. Cruft, a word every bit as textured as crust or dust, and others which refer to physical rinds and remainders. Last paragraph. Knowledge of the human past turns up in all kinds of unexpected places. Scholars of the analog world have long known this. Writing, after all, began as a form of accounting. Would the Sumerian scribes who incised cuneiform into wet clay have thought their angular scratchings would have been of interest to a future age? Software is no less expressive of the environment around it than any object of material culture, no different in this way from the shards collected and celebrated by anthropologist James Dietz in his seminal study of the materiality of everyday life in small things from Auden. In the end, one preserves software not because its value to the future is obvious, but because its value cannot be known. Nor the myriad challenges and technical or legalistic barriers it presents, or the fear of loss, reason to hesitate. As Carrie Krause has noted in a paper published out of the NDIP and IMLS Preserving Virtual Worlds project, sometimes preservation courts moderate and even extreme loss as a hedge against total and extinctive loss. It also indirectly shows us the importance of distributing the burden of preservation among the past, present, and future, with posterity enlisted as a preservation partner. However weak the information signal we send down the conductor of history, it may one day be amplified by a later age. Long ago, before even the first .com bubble, Sumner Redstone opined, content is king. We heard Micah talk about the importance of content just a short while ago. We all cherish content like a lost lunar Earthrise image or a newly discovered Warhol. Indeed, I would submit that this community has gotten pretty good at preserving at least certain kinds of digital content. But is content enough? What counts as context for all our digital content? Is it the crushed Atari boxes retrieved from a landfill, or is it software, actual executables, the processes and procedures, the interfaces and environments that create and sustain content? Perhaps it is indeed time to revive discussion about something like a national software registry or repository, not necessarily as a centralized facility like Culpeper dug into the side of a mountain, but as a network of allied efforts and stakeholders. In software, we sometimes call such networks of aggregate reusable resources libraries. Software, folks, it's a thing. Thank you.
We've got time for a couple quick questions for Matt.
Do you want to call on folks, Butch?
Yes, you over there. Yes.
So I'm wondering what advice you might give somebody who's uncovered an obsolete storage medium with some obscure old file format. They don't know what to do with it, and they'd love to recover that content. You know, to whom would they turn?
Well, I think my instinct would be to turn again towards the network, whether it takes the form of the expertise that's gathered in this room, the open network on the web. One thing that I've found over and over again in my own work is that there is a lot of knowledge and expertise out there in pockets of so-called hobbyists, enthusiasts, and that's, I think, something that we all can continue to do a better job of leveraging.
One more over there, and then we'll.
I was wondering if you could give me guidance about how to think about software that doesn't quite reach up to the level of it actually being released. So I write a script to clean up a CSV file, somebody writes a 100-line Python thing to import or migrate something.
Yeah.
Is this software we should think about preserving? How is this going to fit into one of these structures?
Yeah, I think the question there would be preserving for who. So who is the audience you have in mind? I think software like that, in fact, is preserved, quotation marks, every day, precisely in repositories like, say, GitHub, where it's reused, recycled by other programmers so that they don't have to write the same code themselves. Whether it has sort of longer, more what I would term artifactual value to posterity, I think is a question, again, about audience and context.
Another round of applause for Matt Kirschenbaum.